fair housing for families, reasonable accommodations, and reasonable modifications. Know your rights. This information was brought to you by Washington County, the City of Hillsborough, and the City of Beaverton in partnership with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Meet the Patel-Sanchez family. Maria and Fatima are married. They have an 8-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son. Grandpa Sanchez lives with the family. They live in rental housing. Grandpa Sanchez has a disability. He lives with depression. Grandpa would like to have an assistance animal to restore equal enjoyment to his housing, but his landlord has a no-pet policy. Grandpa Sanchez is going to request a reasonable accommodation. What are reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications? A reasonable modification is a physical change to the unit, like adding a ramp to the entrance of a unit or grab bars in the restroom. If the housing is not federally funded, for example, housing owned by an individual or private landlord, then the person making the request will pay for the reasonable modification or physical change to the unit. If the housing is federally funded, for example, housing owned by the local housing authority, then the housing provider will pay for the reasonable modification or physical change to the unit. A reasonable accommodation is when a person who lives with a disability makes a request for a landlord to make an exception to a policy, rule, or procedure. Why are reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications necessary? A reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification might be needed if a symptom of someone's disability is a barrier to equal access or enjoyment of their housing. Reasonable accommodation requests and reasonable modification requests can be made at any time during the rental process. That means while applying, while living in the unit, or during move-out, even after receiving a notice from your landlord. For example, someone living with a disability might write a reasonable accommodation request asking for more time to move out. You can request a reasonable accommodation or modification in many ways. This can be verbally, in a handwritten or typed note or letter, or by email or fax. You do not have to state the nature of your disability or the symptoms of your disability. You do need to state that the request is needed to restore equal access or enjoyment of the unit and that it is directly connected to a disability. Documentation from a qualified individual is needed to verify the reasonable accommodation or modification. Verification is not needed if the disability is evident. For example, someone who uses a wheelchair requesting a reasonable modification for a ramp to be added would not need to provide documentation. Verifiers can be, but are not limited to, doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, pastors, and drug and alcohol counselors. Verification can come as a letter, email, fax, or directly from the tenant or verifier. Landlords should accept reasonable accommodation and modification requests and make the necessary change to the physical unit or their policy, rule, or procedure. When is a request unreasonable? It has to do with the impact on the housing provider. Housing providers should not be second-guessing the qualified individual's verification. Housing providers can turn down reasonable accommodation requests and reasonable modification requests for 4 reasons. 1. Is the request too costly? The housing provider should be able to prove this within their financial records. For example, a reasonable accommodation request to pay rent on the 15th of the month may become too costly for a landlord who needs to pay the mortgage on their property on the 1st of each month. 2. Will the request cause an undue burden? For example, taking many hours of administrative time each week to meet the request. 3. Is it asking staff to do tasks that are not part of their job description? For example, caring for someone's assistance animal. And 4. Is it a danger to other residents of the property? For example, making a reasonable accommodation request for a live-in caregiver who has a history of predatory sexual crimes. If your reasonable accommodation or modification request has been denied for reasons other than those mentioned here, document your interactions with your housing provider and contact the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon provides advocacy services regardless of income or immigration status, and translation services are provided. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon website is fhco.org. The phone number is 1-800-424-3247, extension 2. Your call or website contact will be returned within 3 business days. The Fair Housing Act ensures equal access to housing choice. Grandpa Sanchez's reasonable accommodation request has been met, and equal enjoyment of housing has been restored.